After the recent competition for making the normal quality chemical science, I started to take a look at my Q2 version, or uncommon quality, that I made. And it's funny how you look at a design like this, and at the time when it was designed, it was like, oh, this was better than what we had before, which is true. The design that I had created previously for uncommon science was, well, kind of a catastrophe, and was a lot larger than it needed to be. So this was an improvement because we got rid of like some of the silo chesting and some of the excessive sulfur processing that was done. But kind of just looking at it now, there's so many wake lists that are kind of going on. Like, this whole head module could definitely use some improvements in terms of its design. So what I figured we'd do today is I'll go through and kind of practically take some of the lessons that we learned from the Q1 version and apply it to Q2 so that you can A, see the differences, and then B, selfishly for myself, I want to explore like which one is actually better, making uncommon science for chemical science, or making it in the common flavor of it. So I'm going to go now into the editor world, and I'm going to go and basically take a look at this current existing copy that I have, and then see what changes we can make. First off, like just before we get there, I think the first thing that I'm going to want to change is the red circuit layout. Although, yeah, I did just post a video talking about how silo chesting is now improved. It is, but I still have the problem that I always have a ship orbiting above Novice that is constantly requesting biter eggs. So because it's constantly requesting them, then it still takes up some space platform update time, like not a whole bunch. Like, it's still like better than it used to be, with all these ships just happening to be hovering over Novice would cause that trigger to happen. So like space platform time is now substantially reduced because of it, but there is still some overhead because of the way that I have Prometheum laid out. So I'm still going to try to avoid doing silo chesting in the current design, and see if we can get I don't think we're going to need it. We proved that in the Q1 science competition that we didn't need it. So going in and making these changes so that we can probably redo red circuits, and honestly, we can probably take a lot of the inspiration from the red circuit layouts that were there for Q1 and apply it directly to Q2. The main difference is we're going to need a source to create uncommon copper now instead. So let's go over to the editor world. Let's go mess around with that. All right, so we're in the editor world. So the first thing that I'm going to do is let's break down at least the three things that I want to focus on for improvements. So what I want to focus on is red circuit production. Let's touch a little bit on sulfur upcycling. Let's see if we can make that slightly better. And that would be its own kind of segment on that. The next thing that I want to do is engine production. So what I'm thinking is going to be better, because we notice, like, if you look at here, we're trying to do direct insertion here. And I think that the benefit here is not going to be as strong as we had previously. So, because like if you look at these were the top two designs that had almost zero difference between them. One that was doing engine insertion directly from a foundry making pipes, and then another version over here that had effectively where the engines were belt driven. So I think for strategically, the way that I'm going to go about this is recipe switching is not going to make sense for Q2, because we just don't have the pure raw speed of the foundries. So what we'll probably do is just create an engine block and then feed that separately directly into like a assembly that looks probably similar to this. I actually really like the layout that Theon came up with here, so we'll toy around with that a little bit. The two benefits there is that I think the clocking is going to be pretty easy and to do for engines this way. And then also the clocking is going to be pretty easy to do for the head module as well, because you can actually use some of the timings already that Theon came up with for this engine block here by just replicating this, but now in Q2. So that's probably the easiest route. So with that, let's go into the actual engine design first. So I've already pre-designed this entire setup here. So I'm going to walk through kind of the considerations from the ground up of how I computed a lot of the clocks that we're using, and overall some of the simplifications that I made down the line. This is not the full end design. There is one slight optimization I make to use only one global clock to control everything that you're seeing here. But the main core concept around this is exploring this new clocking method that we realized works a lot better in the Q1 competition, so the common flavor of chemical science. So the main benefit has been that there's less activation or control network update time going to an inserter if it's just enabled for a longer period of time. So that's double swinging, triple swinging, whatever. The number of cycles that you can get, like you can see here, this is swinging 4 or 5 times every time into the steel furnace, for example. That winds up being better than the short start stop cycles. So long bursts are a little bit better because overall the signals, as you can see over there on the right, are changing a lot less frequently. They're just almost kind of like a latch, so to speak. So just latching when you actually need them. Let's explore this from the ground up. So what we'll do is we're going to take just a section of this, and let's go and I'll remove all the clocking and everything from this here, and then we can basically explain how this setup itself works, and then how you can compute the clocks yourself for it. So I've removed all the wires here now, so we are starting fresh from just basically from the beginning. So quick note on layout, the reason I chose this particular layout is because it's nice because we get 10 beacons around the assembly machine. You could technically get one more beacon in here if you wound up doing a design that had a basically a chest in between. So something like this, and you could basically offset this, and then you could squeeze one extra beacon right here. But I find that that's not going to be necessary because anyway, basically all that's going to do is just have more resting time for this and potentially a little bit more resting time for the furnaces. So we could try that, but I'm going to go with just a pure direct insertion build here and then get as many beacons around that we need. So this already works out nicely because 10 beacons, basically if you have 5 of these, that's going to get you over the 60 per second that we're going to need. So this is already enough supply-wise for us. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create a clock that every single time this finishes crafting 32 items, I want to dump both of them directly onto this belt. Now we sideload this because this winds up being a little bit easier because it gives a mini buffer here for basically some of this to sit idly, and then you don't have to worry about always inserting it exactly on the, basically within the spacing. So you don't have to worry as much about the spacing between these because that can kind of get annoying if your inserter is blocked for any reason and you're dropping longer, and that takes up extra UPS if you're dropping onto a belt longer. So to avoid that, we did this kind of side loading thing. A little bit extra transport belt line cost, but this is substantially easier to set up and works in a lot more places. So that's what we're opting for here. So then the next thing that I will immediately point out then is layout wise, I've chosen to use direct insertion for the pipes. And the main reason for that is just because the consumption of this is much higher. So it's a 1-to-1 of as many engines that we need. So if, compared to a 1-to-2 ratio of what we're going to need for gears and steel. So this is only half the throughput. So for that reason, this is very, very infrequently picking something off of a belt, as you're seeing here. We're only going to need 30 items per second per belt to feed 60 items per second on the output. So very, very low throughput. We could literally use a yellow belt for this and we'd be completely fine in terms of how much we need. So for that reason, this is going to be fine just crafting here. And also for the reason that having a whole bunch of chained extra, we'd have to have a gear and a steel input directly into here, and we'd get a lot less beacons that we could actually fit around here. So for that reason, belting is going to be completely fine. We also saw that in the Q1 series, so that's a kind of a quick note on the overall layout of the design. All right, so next let's talk about clocking. So some of the simple things that we need to kind of consider for clocking is some of the fundamentals. So first, when you're talking about clocking, we're talking about ticks, then you actually have to understand what the inserters are doing. This is kind of the more complexity of clocking is you need to know the underlying mechanics of how many ticks each of these different components take and inserters take to swing. So simply put, the amount of ticks it's going to take to pick up from a belt, now specifically a belt that is a straight belt like this, not an underground belt, is going to take 12 ticks round trip. So from pickup until drop off. So 4 ticks to pick up 4 stacks, so 1 tick per stack, and then 4 items, and then basically unload those into the actual assembly machine here. Now, this is under the caveat that there's the back pressure scenario, so if you do not have back pressure, and by back pressure I mean the belt is basically barely moving like this, then, and it's free-flowing, then that timing changes. So then the timing is dynamic, and that's not guaranteed, so that it can be higher than 12 ticks. So just keep that in mind, always have back pressure, you can guarantee the minimum amount of ticks to pick something up from a belt. Then dropping a belt is exactly the same, it's going to take 12 ticks total to drop onto a belt, as long as there's 16 items already in the assembly machine. So Those are the two numbers. Belt interactions is 12, as long as the belt is not output blocked. And that's a big reason that why we do this side loading here is to make it so that you never have to interact with a belt that's not moving. Second thing to kind of take into consideration is what happens when you're moving from an assembly machine to another assembly machine. That's going to be a total of 8 ticks that it's going to take to transfer. So it's in 1 tick, it can instantly pick up all 16 items, again, assuming that it's back pressured like this. And then it will drop all 16 items, 8 ticks, basically within 8 ticks, it will be able to drop it into the assembly machine and come back. So you really only need 2 ticks or so to actually activate the inserter and drop it into the assembly machine for direct insertion, and you need at least 4 ticks to basically pick up from a belt to kick off the animation. So since you can see here that a lot of these are double swinging, so 1, 2, you're going to need at least over 12, you're going to need at least 16 ticks to activate this inserter in order to kick off the animation to swing for the second time. Alright, those are the basics. The next thing that we have to understand is let's go into a clock, right? So I've got a simple blueprint that I use for clocks. If you want to understand how clocks in general work, as the Factorial Wiki has an explanation of it. But basically what we're going to do is we're just going to set a clock here and we're going to set some number here. And if we want this to be 60 ticks, you have to remember that the clock goes back down to 0, so you have to be off by 1. So if you want 60 ticks, it's actually 59 is the condition here that you need to set in order for it to wrap around correctly. So then basically, and you can also confirm this here, if we look at this, this is 52 right now. We go 60 ticks into the future, which is our target. You should see that this comes right back to 52. So the next thing that I want to kind of consider is, okay, we've got a clock. We've got what should the clock ratio be? So our goal is to have this inserter swing twice and pick up 32 items from this assembly machine here. So we want it to be activated for 24 ticks, but how long? So simply what we could do is we could say, okay, well, I want a clock here, and whenever the clock is, let's say, greater than basically 1, so greater than equal to 1, and I'm just going to do this to make this really simple, just to think about things in terms of instead of starting at 0, we're just going to do greater than equal to make everything really nice and simple. And then we'll say this is greater than equal to 1 and less than equal to 12 times 2, so 12 ticks to drop. So that'd be 24 ticks. And then we'll just simply send an engine out, right? So that'll be the first part. So now we got it, but we know that this is not the correct timing because we need 12 items per second is what we're going to be needing to craft, not 16 items. So we got to kind of change the clock a little bit to basically figure out what the wraparound condition should be for the clock. We know it's not going to be every 60 ticks, otherwise 60 would be the wraparound condition if we are producing 16 items per second. So simply to kind of figure that out would be, okay, well, we know that we're going to need 12 items per second, and we know that because we're going to need 5 copies of this. So 60 divided by 5, right? So 5 machines that are making 60 on the output. That means we're going to need 12 basically per second. So, and that's in 60 ticks, right? So then we just say, okay, so 16 divided by 12, that's going to be every 1.33 seconds, we're going to wind up having to go and basically pull something out of this assembly machine. Well, that's an odd number. We don't want to use that. So the easiest one then, what we can do afterwards, we can just multiply this by ticks, right? So this gives us, okay, cool. So very simply, every 80 ticks, we need to pick up from the assembly machine. Now that's only going to get us 16 items, right? So we want 32. So just simply put, we just multiply this by 2 and we get 160. So cool, that's what we need. So then our target condition for how often to pick something up out of this machine is now just simply 160. So let's just change this to 159. And we'll see that now this inserter, once we hook all the wires up, will start to double swing. So I'm going to use red because I like using red for outputs. And we're going to go ahead and hook all these up. And then you can see with Circuit Visualizer here, all these that are connected. And so we need to go and set a condition here. And let me make sure that I've got, I need to make this an and condition. That was my bad. Okay, so now we have everything correct. And you can see that these are now double swinging. Cool. So now basically based off this, now what we need to do is we kind of want to, we're going to have to delete this one time because we want to synchronize all the states of all the assembly machines to be based off a clock and not to be based off of kind of randomly whenever they were happen to be picking up from a belt. But because like right now you can see that this is basically the progress bar is bonus productivity is 19%. This has 12 in it and this has 10 in it and this is 72%. If we remove all of this and basically just start over from the beginning, you'll see that those will naturally now synchronize themselves because the output is now being constrained when we can drop items out of them. So we'll see this now here. This is 24 items, and this is 24 items. So, and bonus productivity is a little bit offset at 12%, and that's why you're seeing that there's 14 items being held in here. This will all get fixed the moment that we start clocking now the input inserters. So how do you figure those out? Well, I've got a couple copies here just to make this easy for us, and I've already done the math on them, so I'll put them out here, and then I will just basically walk through and explain how they work. So the next thing that I'm going to do is here, I'll explain kind of the overall crafting cycle. So we're just going to start off real simply. In the beginning of it, we want to grab the items out of the assembly machine. So we're going to say the very beginning phase is when we throw things out of it. It's a little bit counterintuitive because you'd say, well, don't you want to put the items into the machine first? Sure, you will. You either do this at the very end of the cycle or you do this at the beginning. The easiest way just to think about it is the very first phase of what you're going to do when you're underclocking machines like this is you're going to grab the items out. Cool. That's a reserved space. Everything from 0 all the way to 24, that is going to be reserved just for throwing things out of the assembly machine. We don't do anything with inputting during this time. Next thing that we do is we say then, okay, cool. After this is done, picking up everything out of the machine here, we're going to go and we're going to basically say that, and I've changed this a little bit. It's 1 to 24. This can also be 25. So let's just go ahead and set that. That's fine. It doesn't make a net difference. This would be tick 1 all the way until tick 25. This would be 1 plus 24. So that'd be the 25th tick, right? So the next thing that we wind up doing then is we say, okay, 1 tick later is when I want to start activating the inserters to start throwing them, all the items into the assembly machine. Now, what I want to happen is because the automated insertion limit is 18 here, we should be able to easily be able to throw 2 swings of pipes in here. Now, the automated insertion limit here is 9 for these, so we can only put 1 swing in there. But that's completely fine because 16 items that we put into here with productivity is going to translate into 32 items of engine units. So that's all completely good. So then what we basically are going to keep in mind is this inserter is going to swing twice back to back. We know this is going to take 8 ticks. So for 16 ticks, this needs to be active, or just really simple, you could just give it 12 ticks. That's enough for it to basically finish its animation and kick off again. So that would be perfectly fine. So to do that here, you see basically I started it off 1 tick off of the output timing. So 25, now we're at 26th tick. We're going to start. And we're going to just say simply 26 plus we're going to take a total of 16 ticks to put this out. So there you go, 42 ticks total. That's all we're really going to need. We can shorten this a little bit because we don't need the activation time, but it's not going to make any difference because the insert is just swinging during that time. Cool. So let's go ahead and hook these up, connect, and then let's connect these over. I already have a green wire connected over here, and I will start the time so that we can actually watch the circuit visualizer do its magic. And then we'll connect this and connect this. Again, I'm just using anything for this symbol, and the reason I do it is just so that I've gravitated towards using this now because then I can use any signal that I want to be sent over this wire here, and it makes it a little bit more descriptive when you're looking at the clocks here in alt mode like this. So cool. So now you're seeing, and we press F5 to look if there's any wake lists. See, there's a tiny little wake list there. We can tune that and fine tune that there in a second. But basically, let's just keep that because theoretically, that's the amount of time that it's actually going to need to basically insert everything. There's no reason to go and fine tune the clocks themselves. We're just going to work in theory right now until you've actually gone and you're clocking all of the inserters because they may be off a little bit. So the next thing that we'll do is here for the gears, we're going to basically go and wind up doing the exact same thing. We're going to start off at the 26th tick, and then we're going to go now instead of 16 ticks forward. Well, we know that it's going to take a total of 24 ticks to pull from both sides of the belt here. So we'll just simply do okay. We are here at 26 plus 24, and that will get us to, let's see, 26 plus 24, and that will get us to 50. And you go, ooh, why did you have, why was it less than that? Well, the reason that I'm doing that and is mainly just so that I'm explicitly limiting when it could pick up to prevent desyncs. So let me remove a couple of these here. And again, this is kind of where I was talking about in the very beginning, understanding what is going on with the inserters during their activation phases is very useful. So you really only need 4 ticks to pick up from a belt like this. And so you'll see the occasional kind of flickers that are happening here because it's active for longer than it actually needed to, because the last tick, when it's done with its cycle and comes back, it does one more check, and we want to prevent that check. So the easiest way to do that is we can just say, okay, well, I'm going to start at the 26th tick, I'm going to go 12 forward because that's the full time it's going to take to swing there and swing back, and then I'm just going to go and give the extra activation that I'm going to need. So we're just literally just going to need an additional 4 ticks for that to basically kick it off and swing. So that'll be until 42. So let's go and watch this now. And you're going to see there's going to be a little bit of a desynchronization until this whole thing basically kicks off and should naturally synchronize itself again. So now, as I'm running this at 32x speed and watching this completely now, you're seeing that these are both always double swinging, and all of these are always inputting exactly when needed without wake lists. And you can see that even these occasional little wake lists that are coming from here have gone away as well, now that everything is nice and synchronized. The nice thing that you're going to notice too, off the bat, is that this is constantly sitting idle. So I'm actually not going to clock this inserter at all. The reason being because this is an intermediary. I want to clock this and I want to clock the outputs, but there's no reason to clock this and add extra overhead from the circuit network because this is naturally going to always be output blocked so quickly. So like this is going to craft, this crafts at 105 items per second, so way faster than we actually need it to. As you can see here, like in the full amount of times that this is going to swing, all 3 times that it swings back to back, this is already done with its crafting cycle. So there's no reason to go and add an extra clocking overhead for this, and wake lists here are completely fine for it just to subscribe to this entity and then stop and wait. So it's only going to monitor this when it's doing its checks and when it actually completes a craft, and since the crafts are done, by the time that this has stopped swinging, there's no reason to add any clocking. However, where you are seeing a lot of flickering is going on is here. Now, this one is a little bit more complicated to figure out the exact clocking, and this is where we're going to all of a sudden have to change our base clock so that we can use one clock for everything here. And the reason that it changes is because this has a bonus productivity of 50%. So that means that all of a sudden now we're living in a world where we're now a 1-to-3 ratio, right? So 50% is a 1.5x multiplier. So if you think about, okay, like how much are we going to need per total 160 ticks, right? Well, we're going to need to craft 64 total, iron that we're going to need to put into this machine every 160 ticks. So if you think about that, then that's basically going to say, okay, then we need to craft 64 every 160 ticks. That's completely fine. We've got plenty of bandwidth to do that because we're basically here, this machine can make 27 per second. And so we're also seeing here that this is naturally able to do it. So it's not a problem of production, it's just more of stopping these random flickerings from happening. We just want to have a phase where we're inserting things into. So I'll talk about that here next. As I was preparing the next section to talk about how to figure out the productivity side of things, I added some notes here just to kind of explain this. And as I was writing this down, I realized like, okay, so we have 60 for the output, 12 engines per machine. We have an output of 32 items every 160 ticks. We insert 32 pipes from tick number 26 to 42. And then I realized like, okay, hey, hold on, this is redundant. But why is it redundant? Well, the reason it's redundant is because, well, before when I said, there's that 4 tick difference between like basically picking up from a belt versus picking up from a machine, and you really only need 4 ticks to actually drop it. So we don't need basically the full 24 ticks here. We don't need the full 16 ticks, and we can just split the difference and just align both of them to have the exact same start and stop cycle. So what that means is we can actually get rid of this entire combinator here as a whole and just connect all these inserters up. So that's exactly what I did over here. So now there's just one clock for the pipes, which double swing, and these also double swing, and they can do it in the same amount of time. So there's no reason to have an extra one. So great, that's eliminated. So next, as you can see here, I've expanded some of these clocks here, and there's a reason for that. So the quick kind of like notes that I'm going to say here is, first, in order to figure out, how much are we going to need for iron, let's just work backwards and include the productivity here. So we know that we're going to need 64 iron every 160 ticks to make the 64 pipes that we're going to need. So, okay, cool. So 64 divided by 1.5 is 42.6 infinitely repeating. So, or 42 and 2/3 iron ore per 160 ticks. That's bad. We don't want a ratio like this. So the easier way to kind of think about this is to expand that and just say, okay, well, what does that really mean? Well, AKA that's 128 iron ore every 480 ticks. So if you just multiply this, basically this 160 times 3, then you're going to get 480. So that'd be 128 that we're going to wind up needing basically every 480 ticks. So, okay. So then we'd say, okay, that's also AKA 16 ore per second, or AKA 1 swing every 60 ticks. So some issues that you kind of run into here is you could say, okay, well, simply then we could just say, all right, I want to put in 128 iron ore, like back to back to back every 480 ticks. Well, that's just not going to work because the crafting speed of this machine is 27 per second, right? So okay, that's not going to work. So then you kind of say like, okay, what's the easiest way to figure out what the ratio is going to be? Well, the automated insertion limit here is 22, so we can do 2 swings at least. So then the easiest one then to do is say, okay, if we want 2 swings to happen, how often does that happen? Well, 1 swing is every 60 ticks, so every 20 ticks we can do, or every 120 ticks, we can do 1 swing. An easy way to do that is to grab a modulus operator here, right? So the easiest way to kind of do this, and without having to greatly expand the base conditions here and keep the conditions really simple, is to add an extra arithmetic combinator. I can show how to do this without this, and then you can add a whole bunch of stacking conditions here, and that might be slightly better for UPS because we can basically remove 1 extra one, but this is so much simpler that I'm just going to quickly show this to show the principle first. So what does this kind of mean? So that means that 480 ticks is now our baseline, because 480 divided by 160, that works, right? So 480 divided by 160, we're going to get 3 for that. And then you're going to see also for the 120, well, that 120 goes also into 120, right? So it's every 4 times, so 4 cycles. So instead of multiplying this out and having 12 times the amount of the base clock and then keeping all this in here, we can just very simply wind up just saying, okay, well, we're going to have a base clock that is now 480 ticks, so we're always -1. And then we go and feed that into a modulus operator. What this basically just does is it just says, hey, just wrap it around every time we get to 160. 160 is the base, the original clock that we had for this. Now, the other clock that we need over here is every 120 ticks. So every 120 ticks, we're going to wind up basically just doing a double swing and a double inserter swing right here for these 2 inserters. And those 2 will transfer then every 120 ticks, 32 items into the assembly machine. Now, I had to change the clocking a little bit here compared to the 24 that you're used to, or the 25 that you're seeing over here, because we're pulling from an underground belt. So that means we just need a couple extra ticks to actually activate it and be able to pull completely from an underground belt, because it takes a little bit longer to pull this way. So I wound up changing it around a little bit to mess with the timing. And that's actually how you wind up doing this, and makes it really simple. The reason this is nice is because now I don't have to add a whole bunch of extra conditions all the way from 160 all the way up to 480. So we'd need then basically in every 120 ticks, or every 160 ticks, we'd have to add another condition. That's not too bad. Like, you could go and do that, but you'd have to have 4 conditions in here. So maybe it's worth it for UPS. I'm just going to ignore it, and I will just basically do this modulus operator because it's way easier to just think about it that way, at least for me, instead of having a whole bunch of extra conditions to basically align them. And this is good because, like, then now we have a base clock that's based on the base input rate that we actually need based on the calculations that we've done. So that means that, like, that's one way to quickly and easily work backwards, is just say, okay, cool, I'll keep the base of what I had, which was a 160 tick cycle for the engines, and everything was based on that. And then I just say, okay, modulus 160. So then I just need a combination of 160 times 120 that works out in both cases to feed basically this machine. And 160 and 120, what's the least common multiplier of that? That's 480, right? So, and you can either do this yourself, basically be the 12 and 16, you know, what are those 2 times each other? Be 192, and then you can basically figure out, well, what's least common multiple of these, right, is going to be, well, there's 4, 3, so it's going to be basically 4 and 3, which is going to be 12, so that's 120, and then that's going to be the number, and then you just multiply that to get up to something that fits into 16, so times 4, so it'd be 4 times 4 times 3, which is 448 times 10, 480, 480. So that's at least a how that actual clock works. And now if we look at wake lists, you can see that basically the only thing that has a wake list is now the inserter inserting into here. And that works out completely fine. And again, not that it works out completely fine. More explicitly, what I mean is this works now in the sense that this will just rely on wake lists because this will always overproduce, so it barely has to monitor anything. There's no point in clocking this, and everything else always double swings. Everything else is all double swinging, and everything's in a good spot. So the reason I show this is because the simplest way that I've started to begin to think about everything is kind of getting away from thinking about things in terms of like still to think about things in terms of ticks, but like your base clock almost all the time is going to be base 64. And that totally makes sense because all the items that you're going to input and output at ratio based on your output ratio that you're going to need is all base 16. So they're all going to be some multiple of 16, right? So 480 is a multiple of 16, 160 is a multiple of 16. It just goes into it 10 times. This goes into 12 times, right? So just looking at this is now just based on the recipe. It's like very simply just now a ratio of those things. So I found it easier to, although it's conventionally easier to think about things in terms of ticks and in terms of seconds, getting away from seconds and just thinking about ticks and then just thinking about the ratios of those makes the math all really nice and simple. And then just modifying your base to fit all the different clocks that you need. So we're going to further expand this now by getting into the steel production of it. But I'm going to quickly swap out this top section because we've already made the improvements now to these wires. So I'll finish that up and then we'll start tackling this next section. And I'll show how we can use this same original one clock to now control everything that's in here using that modulus operator. So here's now this in its final form. You'll notice here that I have now cut off basically the inputs so that this is only a half section because we only needed to have 5 of these to make basically the amount that we need. So it's over 60. And you can see here, this is a red belt, and you can see how it's perfectly aligned that whenever this basically outputs 2 items, is always perfectly fills in the extra gaps. And this is a faster belt than we actually need, but in practice, this is now throttled to only be the total of 60 items per second and stacked all the way up to 15 items per second per side. Then basically this is going to be a total of 60 items per second, and it's completely on the output. One caveat that I will say, you notice how this is always constantly flickering? Well, that's because this is exactly clocked for when we should be putting items in. And you can see how it exactly runs out always. So the easiest way to kind of get the best of both worlds of not having the inserter overhead and being able to basically just allow this to be output blocked is just literally letting everything run completely until it's basically stops producing. Most builds in general in Factorio benefit from this, and this is actually exactly the reason why, is it allows all the internal machines to fully buffer, all the way up to the total items that they're going to need. So 18, 18, 18, you can see how they're all basically at that max clock. Then you undo, basically, you let basically the output run completely out. And then this will now always have a buffer, basically, of the items that it's going to need every single time this can craft. And this can now basically do all 4 swings that it needs every single time. So with basically almost no flickering at all. And so we get kind of the best of both worlds of this just constantly just swinging and outputting everything. The only downside to this about cutting it off like this is you get the extra basically double check here, where this basically swings twice and then has basically this little pulse here. I'm going to ignore that. I'm not going to care about it directly. It's mainly just because this is only going to have to craft for half the amount of time from this machine into here. So you're just going to have an additional check that could be potentially avoided, but just in general and aggregate, I don't think it's going to make that big of a difference. So now we have, nicely, the exact amount that we need. The next thing though is, okay, let's go and do the same thing, but now for this input module. I did the exact same approach, working backwards, figuring out what the output rate that I'm going to need, but I'll try to cover this at a high level because there's a lot more of that backwards reverse calculations that happened here. But just basically keep in mind that the exact same thing happened, finding out the least common multiple, figuring out all the clocks that you need, but I start off with the output condition. So very simply, I know that I'm going to need 30 steel and 30 gears per side. So we simulate this here with the yellow belt, right? So stacked completely, that's going to be 30 items per second that are crafting here. And you can see this is exactly outputting just in time to fill basically the gaps in the belt. Same thing down here. So The way that this is now working is the exact same way, figuring out the basically the 1.5 ratios with the basically how much you need for this and gears and steel and all that. But basically the output, you're seeing that both of these are connected. They're just connected to something that basically is just saying, okay, whenever this is greater than or equal to 1 and go to 16, drop twice. And you're seeing that here. This basically can drop twice, basically onto the belt. You only need basically that we could go up to 24, but we don't need the extra 8 ticks because this is just going to go the 12 ticks and then get 4 more ticks to basically drop the extra items that it needs, and then it's satisfied and it's done. We do that again at 64 to 77, so that's where I said basically taking the modulus is not quite, we could go lower in the modulus, so this modulus is 128, we could go down to 64, but instead what we're just going to do is I just wound up adding 1 extra condition because that's easier to save basically this additional combinator that we're going to need. So again, you could continue to stack more and more conditions for all different ones, but you're going to notice the reason why I'm kind of talking about this modulus here is because in this particular one here, I've worked out all the different ratios that you're going to need. The final cycle time is going to be the least common multiple of 192 and 640 is 1,920 ticks. So adding that many combinations at 64 tick intervals is going to be a lot. So just to save myself on that, I just didn't feel like going and adding all those. And if you do, then great, you can go and create one. I don't care. And so I'm just going to do mod 128 and have those basically these 2 different ranges around 64 ticks. So the first one and then the 64th tick. So that's half of 128. It's going to output again. So I'm setting just a steel icon here, but that's the same thing for gears and for steel are going to both do the same thing. The really convenient part about, and the reason actually just to explain why I chose to do a chest-to-chest transfer here, is because this allows me to have 1 furnace with 12 beacons completely surrounding it, and that gets me over the 30 per second that we're going to need. If we go down 1 beacon, you're going to see that we're just barely over the limit, and we could do direct insertion here, but I find just basically having this extra beacon specifically around the electric furnace allows for basically to have all 4 swings here. And this was something that actually I'm purposefully adding this extra beacon, funny enough, not for steel. I added it specifically for iron, and that's because I wanted to bump the automated insertion limit to allow me to do 4 swings back to back. I worked this out outside of this, and it took me a little bit to kind of figure out the consumption rate of how long it's going to take to actually consume it in the amount of ticks that this is swinging actively. But basically by doing this so that you can basically get 4 swings completely in here by basically the consumption rate of just how fast this is consuming. And you can also see that here that the automated insertion limit is at 42. And so if you go down 1, the overload multiplier that's on this is going to be 41. And that 1 off makes enough of a difference to prevent 1 extra swing from happening. So, and that's where you see that flicker there. So adding this extra beacon, got this all the way up to a total of 12 beacons, and that actually got us up to the limit that I exactly needed to basically make this work, and that is the reason I made a decision of not direct inserting, but using a steel chest in between, was to get the automated insertion limit just high enough and consumption rate high enough to be able to do 1, 2, 3, 4 swings back to back. So that's, I know I'm glossing over this, but the main thing that I want to kind of just basically say is exactly the same principles that we worked backwards here, but just we figured out then, okay, here's the final combinations, and I'm using basically now arithmetic combinators and offsetting the modulus to get to them. But you notice that the modulus here is 96. See, there's 192, there's 128. They're all multiples of 16, right? So you're going to notice that a lot because our output is base 16. And our output swings are base 16, so everything is going to revolve right around that base 16 interval. Now, I've also designed this in a very nice way so that we can very easily connect it right up to our final build over here. So I'm going to remove this. This is our new clock, which, because we're using modulus, this all works out really nicely because engines have a cycle time of 160, or in other words, when we saw this clock at 480, right? 480 and 1920 are common multiples of each other, right? So 1920 divided by 480, it's 4. So because we're using modulus, we don't have to worry about it. And now this can become our main clock, which is great. So I'll copy this setting over here. And you notice that this will make 0 difference to this side over here because they're all using that modulus operator. So now this is our main clock. And what we can do is we can remove all of these. We can remove this here, all of these extra stuff that's here. And I can just basically remove all of the stuff here. And let's just copy this whole setting and snug it up right next to it. Now we have a nice clock here, and all we got to do is just connect this to here. And now we have basically one unified build that's running off of one clock that connects to all these different ratios that we're going to need for everything downstream. Again, we'll cut off the output, let this run for a little bit until it completely backs up. And then we can basically undo that. And you'll notice that now everything here, sure, I have wakeless intentionally being used, but again, this is an intermediary. I just clocked the boundary condition of the thing that is going to be only having to insert occasionally. See, the wakeless is perfectly fine to double swing, just like this is double swinging. And then, so applying that same principle there, apply that principle here, and so forth. So just because you see wakeless here, it does not necessarily mean that it's going to be, in effect, worse. So, this is significantly harder than doing basically the lead followers or latch lead followers that we've done in the past. And you do need quite a bit more combinators if you're using the modulus operator. I find it easier for me to think about and to create it. So then adding a whole bunch of stacked conditions all on top of each other, but you could save some combinators by doing that. So, but this allows you to have the exact flow, and you can see that this is now basically all completely synchronized, and all the assembly machines will now output exactly at the same time. Everything is nice and synced. And this also is like, you can lose half the build like this, for example, and you'll see that basically this side completely runs out, but the other side will continue to run. And if you gain that side back again, well, everything will nicely just basically synchronize again. The only like optimization that you should do, again, is just because this eventually will run out, the thing you should do is basically just let the build naturally stop and then restart. And that's all you really have to do in the case that you lose material, is just basically pause the build and restart it again. So that's it for some of these double swings and how I wind up computing it. And that's where I'm going to leave it off for this particular episode. In the next episode, we will, now that we have a nice build for this, we'll talk about going and connecting it now to basically, where was I at? We'll try to go and redesign basically the sulfur output. And my plan for sulfur is I want to now run it directly in line right here with basically where the engines are getting output. So because I can run sulfur right on the outside. So we only need, again, like 30 items per second on this side that we're going to need for sulfur. So that's going to be super easy to do. So we just basically need to do that by upcycling. And then we can route, again, on the, for red circuits, we can probably route them right through here on the top, and then connect it all up to a final design that we can use for the output of the actual chemical science. So stay tuned for that. That'll be in the next part of this series. Thank you for watching.